When I first moved into Oakwood Estates, I thought it would be a peaceful new chapter. I was a former Marine, used to order and discipline, but I'd left that life behind in hopes of finding something quieter, maybe even building a future here. The neighborhood looked picture-perfect from the outside, lush green lawns, freshly painted fences, kids riding bikes down clean streets. But on my very first week, I received a bright orange notice taped to my door, a fine for leaving my pickup truck in my driveway overnight. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake. The truck wasn't junk, it was a clean, well-kept Ford F-150, the kind of truck you'd see in any respectable driveway. I decided to take it up with the HOA in person. The notice mentioned that the monthly meeting was open to residents, so that Thursday evening, I put on a clean button-down shirt, tucked it into my jeans, and walked down to the clubhouse. The clubhouse looked more like a courthouse than a community center. Bright white walls, polished floors, and a long oak table in the center where the board sat, 5 of them, each with matching clipboards and stern expressions. At the head of the table was Charles Whitmore, the HOA president. A tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and an expensive watch that gleamed every time he adjusted his papers. I'd heard whispers from the neighbors that Charles ran the HOA like a dictator, but seeing him in person made me believe it. His eyes scanned me like a drill sergeant inspecting a recruit. "You must be Mr. Hayes," Charles said, not even offering a smile. "You're new to the community. I assume you're here regarding the violation." "Yes," I said, trying to stay calm. "I got this notice on my door about my truck. I just moved in. I wasn't aware I couldn't park it overnight in my own driveway." Before Charles could answer, I heard a soft voice from the other end of the table. "The rules about overnight parking are on page 12 of the HOA guidelines," she said. I turned to look, and that's when I saw her, Emily Whitmore. She was sitting quietly, a few seats away from her father, her long chestnut hair pulled back neatly, a notebook open in front of her. She was dressed professionally, but there was something warm about her presence that instantly caught my attention. She wasn't glaring at me like the others. In fact, there was a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "I didn't see any copy of the guidelines when I moved in," I replied, glancing between Charles and Emily. Charles tapped his clipboard with his pen. "It is every homeowner's responsibility to familiarize themselves with the rules. Ignorance is not an excuse. The fine stands, $2,000, payable within 30 days. I almost laughed. $2,000? For parking my truck? That's absurd. A couple of board members exchanged disapproving glances. One of them, a woman with a short haircut and sharp glasses, muttered, "We have these rules for a reason, to maintain property values." I clenched my jaw. With all due respect, my truck isn't hurting anyone's property value. It's not a rusted-out heap. I'm a veteran, I use it for work. It's my only vehicle. Charles leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. The rule applies to everyone equally. If we make an exception for you, we'll have to make one for everyone. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I caught her eyes for a second and she gave me a look, almost an apology. Something in that look told me she didn't agree with what was happening. I took a deep breath, fighting back my frustration. So that's it? No discussion? No warning for a new resident? Just a $2,000 fine right out of the gate? That is correct, Charles said, his tone final. Something in me hardened. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I said, "Fine. But you haven't heard the last from me." The room went still. Charles smirked slightly, probably used to scaring people into submission. But I wasn't like most people. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, my boots echoing on the tile floor. As I reached the door, I heard a chair scrape behind me. Emily's voice called out softly, "Wait." I turned around. She had stood up, her father glaring at her, but she ignored him and walked toward me. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That wasn't fair to you. Here," she handed me a copy of the HOA handbook. "If you read this, you'll at least know what you're up against." Her kindness caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said, taking the booklet. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Look, not everyone on the board agrees with how strict my father is. Some of us think the rules need to be revised. But," she glanced back at the table, where Charles was still watching, "it's complicated." I nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I get it. Thanks for sticking your neck out." Emily gave me a small smile, the kind of smile that makes you feel seen. Then she turned and walked back to her seat, her father already whispering something angrily in her ear. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger at the board, but also something else. Hope. Maybe even curiosity. That girl back there wasn't like the rest of them. And I knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. The weeks that followed that first meeting felt like walking a tightrope. Every time I parked my truck, I half expected another notice on my door. Every time I saw Charles patrolling the neighborhood, yes, he actually drove around with a clipboard some evenings, I felt that same simmering frustration rise in me. But strangely, the thing that kept me from losing my mind wasn't my own stubbornness. It was Emily. It started with small gestures. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I found an anonymous envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note, "Next meeting agenda, page 3. You'll want to be there." I didn't need a signature to know who had sent it. The handwriting was neat, slightly curved, exactly like the way she had written the word, page 12, in her notebook the night we first met. I showed up at that meeting, and sure enough, they were voting on a new rule that would have doubled the fines for overnight parking. When I stood up to protest, I was ready this time. I had copies of case law, examples from neighboring communities, and even a petition signed by 5 neighbors who quietly supported me. The motion was tabled, not killed, but delayed, and I caught Emily's eye across the room. She didn't smile, not openly, but there was a flicker of pride there. After the meeting, I found her standing by the vending machine in the clubhouse hallway. She was pretending to get a bottle of water, but I knew she was waiting. "You were impressive in there," she said softly. I shrugged. "I just didn't want them walking all over me." "That's the thing," she said. "Most people just pay the fine and stay quiet. My father counts on that. He's not used to being challenged." "I can tell," I said, half smiling. She glanced around to make sure no one was nearby, then leaned a little closer. "If you want to fight back, I can help. But we have to be careful. If my dad finds out," she trailed off, her eyes dropping. "If he finds out, what?" I asked gently. She looked back up at me, and for a moment, her confident exterior cracked. "He'll make me choose," she said quietly. Something in my chest tightened. "Choose between what?" "Between the HOA, and you." The hallway was silent except for the hum of the vending machine. I didn't know what came over me, but I reached out and touched her hand lightly. "Then we don't let him find out," I said. She smiled, a real smile this time, and it lit up her entire face. "Deal." From that day on, our secret alliance began. At first, it was just late-night texts about upcoming rule changes, warnings about which neighbors were spying on whom, little bits of information that helped me stay one step ahead. But soon, those messages turned into something else. "Are you awake?" she'd text at 11:30 p.m. "Yeah," I'd reply. "Come outside." I'd step onto my porch and see her walking down the street, her hair loose, her sandals quiet on the pavement. We'd walk the neighborhood together, whispering about everything and nothing. She told me how she'd grown up here, how her father had been HOA president since she was 12, how she'd always felt trapped by the rules she now helped enforce. "You'd think being the president's daughter would give me some kind of freedom," she said once, kicking a pebble across the sidewalk. "But it's the opposite. If I break a single rule, the whole neighborhood talks about it. I can't even paint my bedroom without getting permission." "That sounds miserable," I said. She laughed softly. "It is. But when I'm with you, it doesn't feel so bad." It was a dangerous thing, falling for her. Every time we met, there was the risk of someone seeing us, a neighbor, a board member, her father. And yet, that danger made every moment feel electric. One night, we sat by the lake at the edge of the community, the moon reflecting off the water. She was quiet, hugging her knees to her chest. "What's wrong?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Sometimes I wish I could just run away from all of this. The HOA, the politics, my dad's expectations, everything." "Then run," I said gently. "Run with me." She turned to look at me, her hair catching the moonlight. "You'd really leave with me?" "In a heartbeat," I said. "But I think we can do something better. We can change things right here." That night was the first time we kissed, soft, tentative, and a little scared, like we both knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. After that, our meetings became even more frequent. We'd steal moments wherever we could, behind the clubhouse after meetings, in the empty park at midnight, once even in the storage shed where they kept the holiday decorations. Every time, we talked about more than just HOA politics. She told me about her dreams, about wanting to open her own art studio someday. I told her about my time overseas, the things I'd seen, the friends I'd lost. Some nights we'd argue, about how far we should go, whether we were risking too much, but even those arguments brought us closer. "You don't get it," she said once, her voice sharp but her eyes shining with fear. "If he finds out about us, he won't just go after you. He'll go after me. He'll take away everything. Then we make sure he can't," I said. She stared at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. It was that night, sitting in the dark, her hand in mine, that I realized I wasn't just fighting the HOA anymore. I was fighting for us. And that changed everything. I always knew the HOA would push me, but I didn't know they'd push this far. It started with another notice, but this one wasn't like the others. No bright orange paper this time. This one was an official-looking letter, stamped and signed by Charles Whitmore himself. "Notice of foreclosure proceedings," it read, and for a moment, I just stood on my porch staring at it as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less threatening. When I finally opened it, my stomach dropped. According to the letter, my unpaid fines, which now apparently totaled over $8,000 thanks to administrative fees and interest, gave the HOA the right to place a lien on my property. If I didn't pay within 14 days, they'd begin foreclosure proceedings. It was the middle of the day, and the sun was bright, but suddenly it felt like the world had gone cold. I stormed into the clubhouse that evening. The monthly board meeting was in session, and the moment I walked in, every head turned. "You have got to be kidding me." I slammed the letter on the table. "This is harassment." Charles barely looked up from his clipboard. "Mr. Hayes, please lower your voice. This is a formal meeting." "I'm not lowering anything," I snapped. You're threatening to take my house over some trumped-up fines. He finally looked up, his expression calm, almost smug. You were informed of the rules when you moved in. You've repeatedly refused to comply. The fines are legitimate, and the process is entirely within our bylaws. Emily was sitting near the end of the table, her face pale. I could see the way her fingers gripped the edge of her chair, white-knuckled. This is ridiculous, I said. I have neighbors who leave their boats in their driveways for weeks, and you don't say a word to them. This isn't about rules, this is personal. Charles's eyes narrowed. You're out of order. No, I shot back, I'm done being quiet. Emily suddenly stood up. Dad, this isn't right, she said, her voice trembling but clear. He hasn't done anything to deserve this. Charles's head whipped toward her, his expression hardening. Sit down, Emily. No, she said, louder this time. You're targeting him because he stood up to you. That's not what this board is supposed to do. The room went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on her, and on me. Charles stood slowly, his face red. We'll discuss this later, he said to her, his voice low and cold. At home. Emily flinched but didn't back down. She looked at me, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. I left before I could say something I'd regret. But that night, just as I was pacing my living room, I heard a knock at the door. Emily stood there, her face streaked with tears. What happened? I asked, stepping aside so she could come in. She shook her head, her voice breaking. He told me I'm banned from board meetings until further notice. He said if I don't stop undermining him, he'll make sure I lose my place on the board completely. I felt a surge of anger so strong I had to clench my fists to keep from punching the wall. He can't do that. He can, she said quietly. He controls the board. And he controls me. At least, he thinks he does. I put my hands on her shoulders. Emily, you don't deserve this. She looked up at me, her jaw tight. Neither do you. That's why we're not just fighting him anymore. We're going to take everything from him, the board, the power, all of it. For a moment, I just stared at her. This wasn't the cautious girl I'd first met. This was someone who had been pushed too far, who had decided she'd had enough. You're serious, I said. She nodded. Dead serious. That night, we stayed up until nearly dawn, sitting at my kitchen table with stacks of papers, the HOA bylaws, and a laptop open to county records. We started digging, really digging, into everything the HOA had been doing for the last 5 years. The more we found, the angrier we got. There were fines that didn't match the bylaws, records of closed-door meetings that should have been open to the community, even suspicious payments made to contractors who just happened to be friends of certain board members. This is corruption, Emily said, her voice sharp. It's worse than that, I said. It's illegal. By the time the sun started rising, we had a plan, not just to fight the foreclosure, but to dismantle the board's control completely. Emily leaned back in her chair, exhausted but smiling for the first time that night. We're going to win, she said softly. I reached across the table and took her hand. Together. She squeezed my hand back. Together. That moment sealed it. We weren't just a secret romance anymore. We were partners in a war for justice, for freedom, for our future. And there was no going back. Taking down Charles Whitmore wasn't going to be easy. He had been running Oakwood Estates for almost 15 years, and most of the board were either his friends, his business partners, or just people too scared to stand up to him. But Emily and I had something they didn't, the truth. And once we had a plan, we weren't afraid to use it. Our first step was gathering allies. We started small, talking to neighbors we knew were unhappy with the HOA. Mrs. Delgado, who'd been fined for having too many potted plants on her porch. The Johnsons, who had nearly lost their home last year over a late fee. Even old Mr. Fletcher, who had been quietly paying fines for his American flag pole for years because he didn't know he had a legal right to keep it. We didn't just complain, we showed them proof. Emily had access to the board's records, and with her help, we printed out pages of financial statements, meeting minutes, and photos of violations that had been selectively enforced. We didn't just tell our neighbors that the HOA was corrupt, we proved it. Soon, word started spreading. At first, it was whispers, conversations on driveways, quiet talks at the mailbox. But then, those whispers turned into meetings in my garage, where a dozen neighbors would sit on folding chairs while I laid out the plan on a whiteboard I'd bought just for the occasion. "We have an election coming up in 6 weeks, I told them one night, as Emily stood beside me with a stack of nomination forms. Half the board seats are up for grabs. If we can get enough of us to run, and if we vote together, we can flip this board and take control." There were nervous looks around the room. "Charles will fight back," someone said. "Let him," I replied. "He can't stop a fair vote if we have the majority." The energy in the room shifted that night. People weren't just scared anymore, they were angry. And angry people are powerful. The next few weeks were a blur. We went door to door, talking to every homeowner we could find. We printed flyers, held cookouts, and even organized a neighborhood cleanup day where we handed out information packets disguised as event schedules. Emily worked tirelessly, staying up late with me every night to strategize. But Charles wasn't stupid. He knew something was happening. One evening, as I was coming back from a neighbor's house, I saw his black Mercedes parked in front of my home. He was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, waiting. "Mr. Hayes," he said coolly as I walked up the driveway. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms. "About what?" "You're turning this neighborhood against its own board," he said. "That's dangerous." "What's dangerous is threatening to take people's homes over a couple of weeds in their flower beds," I shot back. His jaw tightened. "You think you can beat me in an election? I built this HOA from the ground up. You're just some angry veteran with a truck and too much time on his hands." I smiled, not because I wasn't scared, but because for the first time, I knew I had him rattled. "We'll see," I said, and walked past him into my house. When I told Emily about the confrontation, she wasn't surprised. "He's going to play dirty," she warned. "We need to be ready." And we were. When Charles tried to change the election date at the last minute, we had already filed a complaint with the county. When he tried to disqualify half our candidates on technicalities, we had their paperwork triple-checked and notarized. Every move he made, we were one step ahead. Finally, election night came. The clubhouse was packed, more residents than I'd ever seen at a meeting. Some had never even attended before, but they were here now, and they were angry. Charles opened the meeting as usual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Emily sat in the front row, no longer banned thanks to a legal letter we'd had delivered to the board last week. When it came time for speeches, I stood up first. "I moved here for peace," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "But I found an HOA that uses fear to control its residents. Tonight, we get to decide if that continues, or if we build something better. Fairer. For everyone." The applause that followed was louder than I expected. Even Emily's father looked unsettled. One by one, the votes were cast. Charles sat stone-faced at the head of the table as the secretary counted them. The room was so quiet you could hear the paper rustle. And then it happened. With a majority vote, the secretary announced, "The following candidates have been elected to the board." My name was the first she read. Then Emily's. Then 3 of our allies. Charles's seat, gone. The room erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged each other. People clapped me on the back, shook my hand. Emily turned to me with tears in her eyes, and before I could stop myself, I kissed her, right there in front of everyone. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that we weren't powerless. That love, truth, and determination could take down even the most entrenched bully. As the meeting ended and Charles walked out without a word, Emily squeezed my hand. "We did it," she whispered. "No," I said, looking around at the smiling faces of our neighbors. "We all did." And for the first time since I'd moved to Oakwood Estates, it felt like home. The morning after the election felt different, like the entire neighborhood had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and saw something I hadn't seen since moving here: people smiling. The Johnson kids were playing basketball in their driveway without their parents nervously looking over their shoulders. Mrs. Delgado was watering her flowers, all 15 pots of them, with a grin on her face. Even old Mr. Fletcher waved at me, his flag flying proudly in the breeze. Emily joined me on the porch, wearing one of my hoodies and holding her own mug of coffee. "You look happy," she said with a soft smile. "I am," I admitted. "For the first time since I got here." She leaned against the railing next to me. "We did it." I turned to look at her. "No," I said, reaching for her hand. "You did it. Without you, none of this would have happened. I would have just paid the fine and stayed angry in silence like everyone else." She squeezed my hand. "Maybe. But you taught me something too. You taught me that you don't have to accept things just because they've always been that way." That day, we called the first meeting of the new HOA board. The clubhouse didn't feel like a courtroom anymore, it felt like a town hall. People actually wanted to be there, to have a say in what happened. Emily sat at the head of the table, not her father. I sat next to her, not as an angry outsider anymore, but as an elected member. "We're not here to punish people," Emily said, addressing the room. "We're here to make this community better. Together." The first thing we did was repeal half the rules that had been causing the most trouble: the overnight parking ban, the ridiculous fine schedule, the ban on flags and flower pots. We replaced them with guidelines that were fair and reasonable. The next thing we did was review every single outstanding fine and lien. Most of them were illegal or inflated. We canceled them all. People cheered. Some even cried. Over the next few months, the neighborhood transformed. Instead of wasting money on pointless enforcement, we invested in real improvements, repairing sidewalks, adding better lighting, even building a community garden that everyone could enjoy. The sense of fear that had once hung over Oakwood Estates was gone. And through it all, Emily and I grew closer. Now that we didn't have to hide, we could be together freely. We'd spend weekends planting in the community garden, organizing movie nights at the clubhouse, or just sitting by the lake watching the sun go down. One night, a few weeks after the election, Emily and I sat on the hood of my truck, staring up at the stars. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to hate this place. I used to dream about leaving and never coming back." I turned to look at her. "And now?" She smiled softly. "Now it feels like home." I leaned over and kissed her, slow and gentle, under the moonlight. "This isn't just our home anymore," I said when we broke apart. "It's our neighborhood. And it's finally free. Emily laughed softly and rested her head on my shoulder. I like the sound of that. Even Charles came around eventually. For months, he refused to speak to either of us, but one day he showed up at the clubhouse during one of our meetings. He stood in the doorway, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. I came to apologize, he said gruffly. I thought I was protecting this neighborhood, but I was just controlling it. You were right to stop me. Emily stood and walked to him, and for a moment, father and daughter just looked at each other. Then he hugged her, and I saw years of tension melt away in a single moment. When he left, Emily wiped her eyes and smiled at me. Guess we really did change things. Yeah, I said, pulling her close. And we're just getting started. We spent the rest of that year turning Oakwood Estates into the kind of place people wanted to live, not because they were forced to follow a rulebook, but because they actually cared about each other. Barbecues, block parties, holiday decorating contests, things that used to feel like obligations became celebrations. Sometimes I'd catch Emily watching me across a crowded event, that same soft smile she gave me the first night we met. And every time, I'd be reminded that all of this, the fight, the risk, the late nights gathering evidence, had been worth it. Because in the end, we hadn't just beaten the HOA. We'd built something better. And we'd found each other. Standing by the lake one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped my arms around Emily and whispered, "You know, they tried to tear us apart." She tilted her head up to look at me, her eyes shining. "Yeah," she said softly. "But all they did," I said with a grin, "was bring us closer." And under the fading light, with the sound of laughter drifting from the neighborhood behind us, we kissed, not in secret, not in fear, but in freedom.